William, Lord of Montbref, was a pious man. Every year on St. Bartholomew's Day, the cross of Montbref Chapel was carried in procession around the castle, while fervent prayers were offered for the liberation of the Holy Land from the infidel Muslims. The Lord's sons, Philip and Stephen, carried the cross as they followed their father in the procession. On this particular day, their prayers were disturbed by the sound of hoofbeats. A messenger. The guard let him pass, for he came from the Count of Beaulieu, the overlord and protector of Montbref and of this entire county. Only after the holy ceremony was Sir William ready to receive his protector's message. It was a call from the Count of Beaulieu to his vassals to follow him to the town of Clermont in the south of France to hear Pope Urban II speak on matters of the greatest import. In the 11th century, the Christian world was beset with many grave problems. The map of Europe was a patchwork of many independent empires, kingdoms, duchies, principalities, papal holdings, and feudal estates, one warring against the other. Even the Christian church was divided into the Latin or Roman and the Greek or Eastern Christian church. In the West, Christianity was further weakened by the quarrels between the Pope and powerful rulers over the right to name bishops. In the East, the Christian Byzantine Empire was threatened by the advancing Turks. To cope with these problems, Pope Urban II traveled from Italy to France, holding councils with bishops and abbots and discussing the threats against Christianity. In the presence of eminent church leaders, Pope Urban received an emissary of the Byzantine Emperor, Alexius Comnenus, who desperately called for help against the invading Turks. This was the opportunity Urban had been praying for, an opportunity to reunite the divided churches of Christ under the leadership of Rome, and an opportunity to strengthen the power of Rome by leading the united Christians into battle for the liberation of the Holy Land. The Pope's sincere desire to help the Eastern Christians made a deep impression on the bishops, who swore to carry this message back to their provinces and arouse the noblemen and the people. In answer to Pope Urban's appeal to come to the meeting at Clermont in the south of France, Sir William and his sons, Philip and Stephen, resolved to undertake the long voyage. They ordered out their horses and took leave of their families. Together, they set out to join their overlord and protector, the Count of Beaulieu, with whom they were to ride to Clermont. On a November day, in the year 1095, the noblemen of France gathered in front of the Cathedral of Clermont to hear the words of the Pope. The Knights of Montbref were among them. As a Frenchman by birth, the Pope first appealed to his fellow countrymen.
O race of Franks, race from over the mountains, race chosen and beloved by God, let the deeds of your ancestors move you and incite your minds to manly achievements.
Then, to the land-hungry nobles, Pope Urban said,
the land you inhabit is too small for your great population, nor does it abound in wealth. Enter upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre. Wrest the land from the wicked race and subject it to yourselves, that land which, as the scripture says, floweth with milk and honey.
In the end, the Pope lashed out against the quarreling princes.
You rage against your brothers and cut one another to pieces. If, forsooth, you wish to be mindful of your souls, either lay down your girdle of such knighthood, or advance boldly as knights of Christ, and rush as quickly as you can to the defense of the Eastern Church.
It is the will of God. These words inspired a great wave of religious fervor. The sign of the cross appeared on the garments of laymen and monks, and on the shields of the knights, and became the symbol of the Crusades. Rapidly, religious fervor spread across France. Itinerant preachers carried it from village to village. One of them, Peter the Hermit, came to Montbref to bring the cross to Sir William's lowly serfs. Impassioned words came from the preacher's mouth, words painting a picture of glorious adventures for the soldiers of Christ. As Peter the Hermit moved on, men and their womenfolk followed him in crowds, blindly confident that God would take care of his soldiers. Such was the power of the appeal of the Crusades among the common people. But the leading noblemen of France were cautious. William of Montbref pointed out to the Pope's emissary that it is not on faith alone that soldiers march. It takes money and leadership to organize a fighting force. Only the firm assurances of salvation in heaven and protection on earth persuaded the barons to make the voyage of God, for it was a dangerous and costly undertaking. But the hope of gaining salvation, treasure, and new lands moved Sir William and many other noblemen to arm for the crusade. And so Philip and Stephen of Montbref led their foot soldiers to Beaulieu to join forces with other vassals under the banner of their protector. While it was a great sacrifice for the Montbrefs to get horses and armor, it was an even more difficult undertaking for their protector and master, the Count of Beaulieu. To obtain needed gold, the Count offered to sell privileges to towns under his protection. The town council of Beaulieu, for instance, collected money from its merchants and craftsmen to buy the charter that would make it a free town. In this way, even before the knights had left France, the first impact of the Crusades was felt. The first crusaders to march across Europe to the east were the peasants. They never reached the Holy Land. The Turks massacred them as soon as they crossed into Asia Minor. The Western knights, marching in small groups, each under the banner of their own master, took different routes to Constantinople, from where they hoped to cross into Asia Minor on Byzantine ships. Leaving behind them a trail of plunder and terror, they finally reached Constantinople late in the year 1096. Philip and Stephen of Montbref were heading a small advance party of the army of the Count of Beaulieu when they first sighted Constantinople. They stopped in awe. It was an imposing sight, truly the capital of a great empire. The Count of Beaulieu, accompanied by Philip and Stephen of Montbref, was received by the emperor. The Count asked Alexius for ships to take the knights across the narrow seas to Asia Minor. Emperor Alexius refused to let the Western armies enter Constantinople for fear they would plunder his capital. Even though Alexius was hard-pressed by the advancing Turks, he withheld his ships until the Western knights were ready to swear solemnly that they would hand over to him all territories they might liberate that had once belonged to his empire. And so, after much violence, threat, and dispute, the Crusaders crossed the sea from Europe to the Near East. Meanwhile, the people at Montbref were also feeling the impact of the Crusades. Whenever word reached the castle that a priest or a warrior had returned from the East, a rider was dispatched to bring him to Montbref. These travelers told wondrous tales about Constantinople, the magnificence of the buildings, the wealth of the merchants, the holiest relics in their churches, of silks and garments, of food never seen in the West, of miracles and sufferings. Philip's wife, Lady Genevieve, admired the beautiful silks and jewels, but in her heart, she longed for news from her husband. Letters were rare, even though Philip had spent many a night writing to his family.
My dearly beloved wife, Genevieve, here follows my story from the day when we left the emperor's capital. Pursuing the most iniquitous Turks through desert and a land without water, we came upon Nicaea, the Sultan's capital. By summer, we drove the Turks out and turned the city over to Emperor Alexius, as we had sworn to do. We kept going on through such desert land where most of our horses perished. At long last, we reached the town of Edessa. There the Count Baldwin left us with his men to marry a native princess with whom he founded the county of Edessa. We others continued on our way. Finally, our knights reached the valley in which is situated Antioch, which is the capital of all Syria. We captured the city, and there we hoped to rest. But the evil Turks returned to the city and surrounded us, cutting off our supplies. When all seemed lost, God saved us miraculously. A humble foot soldier called Peter Bartholomew had a vision of an angel who told him that the lance which had pierced the blessed body of our Savior lay buried in the holy city of Antioch. Peter began to dig for it, and with the help of others, he found it. Carrying the holy lance in front of us and shouting prayers, we attacked and surprised the Turks. An important victory was ours. Now I want you to know that soon we shall be marching again. This time, with God's help, we shall not stop until we sight the holy city.
But it took many months and untold hardships before the crusading armies reached the borders of the Holy Land. They marched past ruins of pagan cities, bigger than anything they had ever seen in their own lands. Finally, the Crusaders crossed into Palestine. To Philip of Montbref and his soldiers, this did not look like the promised land where milk and honey floweth. Now and then, the knights were fortunate to chance upon a shepherd, whom they forced to follow along with his flock, which would provide food for the Crusaders. And then, one day early in 1099, Philip and Stephen rode up to an olive grove that overlooked Jerusalem. There it was, the holy city, the goal of almost 3 years of travel. The city of Jerusalem was well protected by a wall and defended by a garrison of Egyptian soldiers. The Crusaders settled down for a long siege. Provisions were short and water scarce. Sun, thirst, lack of food, and insufficient equipment weighed heavily on the leaders of the crusade. But once again, they found inspiration in faith. Peter the Hermit beseeched the knights to bury personal differences and purge their souls of sin. On July 8, 1099, the bishops, abbots, and monks led the Crusaders on a march of penitence around the walls of Jerusalem. The Egyptian garrison inside the city let the penitents pass without molesting them. They thought them fools to walk around the city wall with the sun bearing down upon them. But the Crusaders found new inspiration and went to work. During the next few days, they secretly built equipment whereby the city was to be assaulted. Then, fortified by prayers, the Christians made an all-out assault during the night of July 13th. The sudden onslaught opened a breach in the city's fortifications. When the sun rose, a second wave of Crusaders attacked the weakened fortification. When the principal towers had fallen, the Crusaders carried the battle into the streets and massacred everyone who crossed their path. Plunder, destruction, and butchery lasted throughout the day. The Crusaders fought in small groups, each under its own leader. No overall scheme of attack was ever planned. By next morning, the victory was almost complete. The wounded began to return to the Crusaders' encampment. Among them was Philip of Montbref. Philip was ambushed by a band of Egyptian soldiers and struck down. The Beaulieu chaplain found him and ordered 2-foot soldiers to carry him to his tent. And while Philip was praying and cleansing his soul of sins, Stephen of Montbref was filling his and his brothers' chests with spoils. So ended the first and only great crusade. Many had set out to liberate the Holy City, few survived to see the day of victory. Because of his wounds, Philip decided to return home as soon as a ship could be found. Before winter snows had closed the roads, Philip of Montbref was once again home, greeting the daughter he had never seen and giving thanks for his safe return. Stephen's betrothed waited anxiously for news from him. Philip brought her presents and a message from Stephen. She was to join Stephen in Palestine, where he had remained as a baron of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In Palestine, Stephen founded the manor of New Montbref, in the vicinity of the harbor of Joppa. It was a feudal manor, much like Montbref in France. But the new lords of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem quickly fell under the influence of the more civilized environment and accepted many of its customs. At the table, foods were offered hitherto unknown to people in Western Europe. Spices from the east came easily by land route to Jerusalem and by sea to Joppa. Venetian, Genoese, and Pisan traders plied their way back and forth, carrying a profitable trade to the west. When Stephen's Palestinian-born son fell gravely ill, a Muslim doctor of great repute came to his bedside. Infidel though he was, the Moslem was wise, learned, and well-mannered. Gradually, the knights of Western Europe acquired new habits, not only in food and clothing, but in learning, in art, and above all, in tolerance. In spite of all this, feudal life in the Near East rested on uneasy foundations. Muslim revenge was inevitable. Less than 50 years after the liberation of Jerusalem, the Muslims were on the march again. They conquered the county of Edessa and threatened all the Latin possessions in the east. When the news reached the west, the Pope asked Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, the most famous preacher of his time, to call for a second crusade. Led by two kings, one German and one French, the second crusade ended in complete failure. Late in the 12th century, a strong Muslim leader emerged. The Sultan Saladin unified the Muslim tribes and in 1187 captured Jerusalem from the Latin Knights. Then, Pope Innocent called for a third crusade. Organized by the foremost Catholic princes of the time, Richard of England, Frederick of Germany, and Philip Augustus of France, three crusading armies were to converge on Jerusalem. Frederick drowned on the way. The French and English kings and their knights quarreled amongst themselves and brought failure to the Third Crusade. Only Richard, by feats of personal bravery, succeeded in securing pilgrimage rights from Saladin. Then in the year 1203, Pope Innocent called for a fourth crusade. To pay the Venetians for needed ships, the crusading knights agreed to fight the Byzantine emperor first. They sailed to Constantinople and conquered this Christian city for the Venetians. In 1204, they founded a short-lived Latin kingdom in Byzantium. That was all the Fourth Crusade accomplished. In 1270, one of the last Christian fortresses fell to the Muslims, and by the end of the century, the Christian knights were driven out of the Near East. The castle at Montbref in France took all these changes in stride. Crusaders and sons of crusaders returned to the West and brought with them new experiences and new habits, that left a mark on the airs of Montbref. New towers were added, new materials tried, new ways of life tested. Crops at Montbref were improved by new methods of agriculture. Windmills like those used in the East now helped irrigate the fields of the manor. From the East, new kinds of merchandise appeared in the market of Montbref with names that carried the flavor of faraway places. Muslins from Mosul, damasks from Damascus, rugs and carpets with arabesque patterns. Eastern spices, fruits and luxuries like sesame and carob, maize and rice, alum and aloes appeared in the Montbref marketplace. The noble ladies of Montbref sometimes ventured into the market to trade with Italian merchants, using new coins to pay for their purchases. The florin, minted in Florence, the ducat from Venice. So by the close of the 13th century, the era of the Crusades came to an end. An era which, in spite of its high cost in life and treasure, profoundly influenced the course of Western civilization.